In this video, I want to go over a little bit what the evidence is that we have for this idea of evolution by natural selection. What is the evidence that organisms have changed over the course of time and that one organism has sort of evolved over time into something else? The best evidence we have is from these things we call fossils. And fossils are the preserved remains of organisms that once lived on the planet that are no longer here. Most of them, they're organisms that are no longer on the planet, but they've left behind some kind of a trace. It might be a footprint, it might be an imprint of their body, it might be sort of a duplicated copy of their shell, something like that. Most of them are formed in rock, specifically sedimentary rock, and they're created in the following way. First of all, the organism dies, and then it gets buried over with some sediment. I'm talking about sand or mud. Then, over the course of time, the hard parts of the organism mineralize. So we're talking about the shells, the teeth, the bones. The soft parts of the body usually do not mineralize. It's mainly the hard parts. And then over time, the surrounding sediment, the sand or the mud, hardens and forms sedimentary rock in the shape of the organism or preserving part of the organism. So here we have an organism that, once lived on the planet, kind of looks like a little bug, named a trilobite. You can see its whole body shape. Here we have a fish, and we have some kind of plant here. So what can fossils tell us? Fossil records document the way life has changed through time. So if we look back at fossils, we can date them, and we can look back through time, and we can see over the course of time that the kinds of animals and plants on the planet have changed. So we look back, we see the first human-like organisms, we see some of the first birds, we see dinosaurs at one point further back, we see the first insects, and so on, going back in time until we finally see the first signs of life at 3. So we can look at a specific organism, the present-day modern horse called Equus, and we can see its fossils and tell a lot about how it has changed over the course of time. We look back in time and we see that at one point in time it was a very small organism, and it had multiple toes, kind of like a dog's foot 50 million years ago. And then over the course of time, we can see that the organism changed slowly. These organisms, the smaller versions of the horse, are no longer on the planet. And today, their nearest relative is the horse that we know today, with the single toe that it walks on, the single hoof. And so we can see it's gotten larger over time, and its feet have changed. Its teeth changed too, but that's not in this diagram. Fossils also tell us about evolutionary transitions. In other words, what are the organisms that show a transition, a change from one to the next? The first example is Archaeopteryx, was first discovered in 1859. This is the fossil, something like this. And this is a transitional form between birds and reptiles, or dinosaurs. So we have dinosaurs, and slowly they evolved into modern day birds. It might have looked something like this. The other transitional form was found in 2006. Of course, there have been many. These are not the only two, but this is my second example, is Tiktaalik. Tiktaalik is a transitional form between a fish and some kind of like a salamander, the first land-dwelling animals. Tiktaalik was something in between a fish and a land-dwelling animal. The second kind of evidence we have besides fossils is something called homologous structures. These are structures in very different animals that show a similar form. And this shows that they're related to one another. For instance, we can look at the arms, the front forelimbs of mammals, and each has a different function. We have a whale flipper, we have a frog foot, we have the horse's leg, a lion, a human arm, and a bat, which is a wing. But inside you see the same humerus bone, you see the radius and ulna bones down below. Actually, in the horse, I think it's here. And then you see the phalanges, you see the wrist bones. So the same pattern of form is in all of them, and that shows that they are related to one another by a common ancestor. We also have evidence in something called analogous structures. These are structures in unrelated animals, but they look the same and have similar functions. And this is what we call a case of convergent evolution. But we see wings in bats, those are mammals. We see wings in some of the dinosaurs. We see wings in a bird. We see wings in insects, and we see wings even in plants. This is a seed. And this shows that there has been evolution of the same form, even though these were unrelated organisms. We see a good example of this when we look at marsupial mammals, which live only in Australia and New Zealand, and we compare them to placental mammals or eutherian mammals, and they live in North America and Europe and Asia and Africa. So we see a little deer mouse and a similar organism. We see a mole and a marsupial mole. We see a flying squirrel and a sugar glider, very similar form, and a wombat and a woodchuck. So these are all animals that share common, they look similar and they have similar functions in the thing, what their body's doing, but they're actually not related at all. These guys are distantly related. The fourth kind of evidence we have for evolution is looking at embryos. And we know that the embryos of many different organisms share common characteristics. So we can look at, this is a fish, a salamander, a turtle, a chicken, a pig, a cow, a rabbit, and a human. And at the earliest embryonic stage, early in development, they almost look identical. As they grow and develop, of course, by the final stages, you begin to see the differences between them. But in the earliest stages, they look similar. This shows that they have a similar ancestry. And in particular, human embryos have gills and they have tails. Here's the human embryo, here its gills, and here's its tail. So that shows that at one point in time, our ancestors were similar. Another piece of evidence, the fifth form, is vestigial structures. Vestigial structures are structures in an organism that seem to have no function, but perhaps they once did in these the animals that were the ancestors of these. For instance, whales have hip bones, and some of them have this little bone here is actually a femur bone, which is the upper leg bone. Also, snakes don't have legs anymore, but they have hip bones. Here's their hip bones, and then here, this little bone is their little femur bone, just like in the whale. But snakes don't use legs, and neither do whales, but they still have these bones, and they still have the hip bones inside that you don't really see. This shows that at one point in time they did have legs. Finally, last piece of evidence is biochemistry. And when we look at the similarity in DNA and even in protein structure, it shows how closely related organisms are to one another. For instance, we could look at the DNA sequence of a hippopotamus and a humpback whale. They don't seem like they're very related, but when we look at their DNA sequence, they're almost identical. There are so many similarities, just like we would of any organisms that are closely related. So those are the 6 forms of evidence that we have for natural selection, for evolution by natural selection: fossils, homologous structures, analogous structures, vestigial structures, embryos, and biochemistry.